Alright everyone, it's time for some more cultural Marxist propaganda from yours truly. Today, we're going to be talking about The Bell Curve, a book that I'm sure many of you have already heard of. The Bell Curve is by far the most popular book of reactionary social science, so it's worthy of a comprehensive critique. A few years ago, Sean made a long video critique of this book. However, I feel like there's a whole lot more that can be said, so I'm making this video. For those out of the loop, The Bell Curve is a 1994 book by political scientist Charles Murray and the late psychologist Richard Herrnstein. I'll do what Sean did and read the back cover to give a sense of what we're dealing with. Breaking new ground and old taboos, Richard J. Herrnstein and Charles Murray tell the story of a society in transformation. At the top, a cognitive elite is forming in which the passkey to the best schools and the best jobs is no longer social background but high intelligence. At the bottom, the common denominator of the underclass is increasingly low intelligence rather than racial or social disadvantage. When The Bell Curve was first published, it sparked a very bitter public debate between pundits and researchers that continues to this day. Charles Murray has spent the last 3 decades defending the book, and he hasn't been alone. The Bell Curve has long had its healthy share of defenders. In December 1994, a letter entitled Mainstream Science on Intelligence appeared in the Wall Street Journal. The statement, signed by 52 academics working within psychology and intelligence studies, defended the most contentious claim of Murray and Herrnstein, namely that racial differences in IQ scores are genetic or partially genetic in origin. So the Bell Curve, while strongly criticized, also had many quote-unquote experts in its defense. We should take a step back, however. The public discourse surrounding the Bell Curve tends to, I think, be quite misleading. The public discourse has overwhelmingly focused on the racial element of the book. However, it needs to be noted that most of the Bell Curve is not about race. Murray and Herrnstein don't discuss race for the great majority of the book. In reality, The Bell Curve is mainly a book about class and the nature of economic inequality. The racial dimension is simply downstream from the broader argument Murray and Herrnstein were making. Fundamentally, The Bell Curve is a book pushing for right-wing economic policies. This is the entire purpose. Charles Murray has been a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a very mainstream conservative think tank, since 1990, and before that he worked for the Manhattan Institute, another very mainstream conservative think tank which is still going strong. Murray is a mainstream conservative policy thinker, and the Bell Curve exists to push a right-wing economic agenda. So what is the argument of Murray and Herrnstein? Their story goes something like this. In old medieval Europe, people inherited their social status. Traits like intelligence and talent had little impact on individual economic outcomes. People were born aristocrats or peasants, and that was that. But in the modern capitalist age, and increasingly so throughout the 20th century, economic outcomes have become increasingly determined by individual behavioral traits, the most significant of which is intelligence. Modern capitalist societies award smart and hardworking people with wealth and social status, and punish unintelligent and unambitious people with manual labor and deprivation. Basically, capitalist societies have become meritocracies where the best and brightest rise to the top and everyone else sinks to the bottom. Crucially, this new class divide reflects a natural genetic hierarchy. Human behavioral traits like intelligence are primarily shaped by genetics, not environment. Murray and Herrnstein cite famous twin and adoption studies to back up their point. The twin studies are particularly important. Murray and Herrnstein argue that the heritability of intelligence is anywhere between 40% and 80%, but they clearly want the reader to think that it's closer to 80%. A heritability of 80% would mean that 80% of the variation in intelligence among the population is due to genes. Murray and Herrnstein believe that genetically based differences in intelligence are the source of economic inequalities within capitalist societies. They argue that the genetically superior are pulling away from the rest of the population, increasing inequality. As a remedy, they propose eugenics.
Of all the uncomfortable topics we have explored, a pair of the most uncomfortable ones are that a society with a higher mean IQ is also likely to be a society with fewer social ills and brighter economic prospects, and that the most efficient way to raise the IQ of a society is for smarter women to have higher birth rates than duller women. The United States already has policies that inadvertently social engineer who has babies, and it is encouraging the wrong women. The technically precise description of America's fertility policy is that it subsidizes births among poor women, who are also disproportionately at the low end of the intelligence distribution. We urge generally that these policies, represented by the extensive network of cash and services for low-income women who have babies, be ended.
When it comes to race, Murray and Herrnstein discuss the black-white IQ gap and suggest it's caused by genetics. They pretend to be agnostic as to what degree they think the gap is genetic, but it's obvious that they think it's overwhelmingly genetic. Ultimately, though, the racial argument is, as I said, downstream of the broader argument. Murray and Herrnstein are arguing that basically every form of inequality we see in modern capitalist societies is the result of genetic hierarchy. Since some racial and ethnic groups are poor and less educated than others, racial and ethnic disparities must be the result of genetics. That's how Murray and Herrnstein reason their way to the race IQ stuff. Murray and Herrnstein end the book with a reflection on the broader political implications of the quote-unquote science they have presented.
For thousands of years, great political thinkers of East and West tried to harmonize human differences. People were defined by their place, whether in the family or the community. So too, for the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, place was all. Society was to be ruled by the virtuous and wise few. The everyday business of the community fell to the less worthy multitude, with the most menial chores left to the slaves. Neither the Greek Democrats nor the Roman Republicans believed that all men are created equal, nor did the great Hindu thinkers of the Asian subcontinent, where one's work defined one's caste, which in turn circumscribed every other aspect of life. The founders wrote frankly about the inequality of men. For Thomas Jefferson, it was obvious that they were especially unequal in virtue and intelligence. He was thankful for a natural aristocracy that could counterbalance the deficiencies of the others, an aristocracy of virtue and talent, which nature has wisely provided for the direction of the interests of society. In reminding you of these views of the men who founded America, we are not appealing to their historical eminence, but to their wisdom. We think they were right.
So, to summarize, Murray and Herrnstein think the unwashed masses should kneel before genetically superior aristocrats, and they express admiration for ancient Greek and Roman slavery and the Indian caste system. This part of the book is almost never mentioned, but it really should be highlighted. This is the crux of the bell curve. The ruling classes are genetically superior to the dumb, backwards masses, and the masses should accept their place and stop asking for nice things like universal healthcare or collective bargaining rights. Alright, so let's turn to two critical concepts in the book, IQ and heritability. First, IQ. IQ stands for intelligence quotient. It's the standard measure of cognitive ability in the psychological field. IQ testing was first invented by French psychologist Alfred Binet in 1905 as a means of identifying children with cognitive deficits. Throughout the 20th century, it was further developed by psychologists working within the field of psychometrics, the study of the measurement of psychological traits. IQ scores aren't meant to be absolute measurements of cognitive ability, but rather relative measurements. Psychometricians construct test items spanning many different domains of cognitive ability, and then test representative samples of the population. They then norm IQ scores to fit a normal distribution, aka the bell curve. An individual's IQ score always falls on this curve. However, it's not actually known whether intelligence is normally distributed. It's just an assumption made by psychometricians. Many phenomena in nature have a normal distribution. Whenever a variable is shaped by many independent and semi-independent factors, the normal distribution emerges. But the normal distribution of IQ scores is purely artificial. IQ tests are constructed to have a normal distribution. If a population starts doing better on average on IQ tests, the distribution will shift away from the bell curve. Psychometricians respond by renorming the test to produce a normal distribution again. Basically, they'll make the test more difficult until the bell curve reemerges. And they have indeed done this before, because during the 20th century, there was a long-term rise in IQ scores throughout the world known as the Flynn effect. I'm saying all this because I think this practice is rather hacky. The normal distribution of IQ scores makes IQ feel like something very natural and biological. Already, by constructing IQ tests in this way, psychometricians are preparing people to see intelligence as an inborn biological trait. If intelligence is shaped by environmental factors like access to quality education, which varies by family wealth and income, then we wouldn't necessarily expect a normal distribution, since neither wealth nor income are normally distributed. The very way IQ tests are constructed is already gesturing toward the hereditarian theory that intelligence is primarily genetic. Next, I want to discuss heritability. Murray and Herrnstein want the readers to think that IQ is close to 80% heritable. This is a figure which derives from twin studies. But first, what even is heritability? Heritability is a measure of the degree of variation in a trait within a population attributable to genes. If a trait is 80% heritable, that means 80% of the variance in that trait among the population is attributable to genes. Heritability is very frequently misunderstood. Heritability is not per se a measure of how genetic a trait is. I know that might sound very confusing, but bear with me. Let's say human height is 90% heritable. That doesn't mean 90% of your height comes from genes and 10% from environment. It means that 90% of the variation in height among the population is due to genes. But that doesn't mean environmental interventions can't still raise human height massively. For example, economic development always massively increases the average height of a population. But this can still be entirely consistent with height being 90% heritable. Everyone gets taller, but 90% of the variation within the population is still due to genes. This is also why high heritability doesn't mean group differences are due to genes. This is a point often made by critics of the bell curve in the context of race and IQ, but I think this is actually a moot point, because I'm going to dispute the idea that psychological traits are meaningfully heritable. It's not just the group differences. I don't think individual variation is due to genes either. And I definitely don't think genetically based psychological differences between humans have anything to do with social inequality. To tackle the claim that psychological traits are genetic, we first have to understand twin studies. Twin studies are thought to be essential tools for understanding the balance between nature and nurture in shaping psychological traits. Researchers examine pairs of twins and analyze the concordance rates for a measured trait. For intelligence, researchers examine how correlated the IQ scores of twins are under different circumstances. The Wikipedia article Heritability of IQ neatly compiles the correlations in IQ scores between pairs of people that have been reported in the literature. As you can see, the correlations between identical twins are far stronger than for all other categories, except the same person tested twice. Identical twins reared together have a correlation of 0.86, and identical twins reared apart have a correlation of 0.76. This is the basis of the claim that intelligence is 80% heritable. It was because of these studies that there was immense confidence beginning in the 1990s that the genes for intelligence and other psychological traits were going to be found very soon, much to the displeasure of leftists and socialists and other bleeding heart types. In fact, let's take a look at the history of these confident predictions. In a 1994 interview with NPR, Charles Murray said,
"We're going to disagree on this. I would ask for you to have me back in 3 or 4 years, and let's see who is right on this issue."
In 2004, the biologist Robert Weinberg said in a lecture at MIT,
"And what happens if one of these days people discover alleles for certain aspects of cognitive function, whatever ability you want, valued or not so valued? What if those alleles begin to come out? And here's the worst part. What if somebody begins to look for the frequency of those alleles in different ethnic groups scattered across this planet? What happens if now, for the first time, we begin to perceive that there are, in fact, different populations of humanity that are endowed with different constellation of alleles that we imagine are more or less desirable? Maybe 3 years from now, somebody will begin to plead that even though they were not criminally insane when they committed a string of serial murders, in fact, it really wasn't their fault because they happened to have this particular genotype, which is known to be correlated with a strong tendency to violence.
In 2009, the University of New Mexico psychologist Jeffrey Miller said in an article in The Economist,
"Human geneticists have reached a private crisis of conscience, and it will become public knowledge in 2010. The crisis has depressing health implications and alarming political ones. The new genetics will reveal much less than hoped about how to cure disease, and much more than feared about human evolution and inequality, including genetic differences between classes, ethnicities, and races. The data are already collected, with DNA samples from large populations already measured for these traits. It's just a matter of doing the statistics and writing up the papers for Nature Genetics."
Also in 2009, the New York University social psychologist Jonathan Haidt wrote in a blog post,
"The most offensive idea in all of science for the last 40 years is the possibility that behavioral differences between racial and ethnic groups have some genetic basis. A wall has long protected respectable evolutionary inquiry from accusations of aiding and abetting racism. The protective wall is about to come crashing down, and all sorts of uncomfortable claims are going to pour in. The discovery that there might be ethnically linked genetic variations in the ease with which people can acquire specific virtues is, and this is my prediction, going to be a game-changing scientific event. I believe that the bell curve wars of the 1990s over race differences in intelligence will seem genteel and short-lived compared to the coming arguments over ethnic differences in moralized traits. I predict that this war will break out between 2012 and 2017.
In 2016, the renowned genetics writer Razib Khan, an outspoken hereditarian, said in the comments of a blog post,
"Honestly, I would just sit on my hands for now. In the next 5 years, the genomic components of traits like intelligence will finally be characterized."
In a sympathetic profile of Razib in the science magazine Undark from 2017, the author Michael Skolson wrote,
"Geneticists will soon get much better at understanding how genes contribute to complex, elusive traits like intelligence. Inevitably, some people will try to connect the dots and show that the genes influencing a trait like intelligence differ between these population groups. Simply pondering such issues will strike many people as racist. But while it's possible to fire Khan from the Times or act as if the alt-right is a marginal movement, these questions are not necessarily fringe."
In a 2018 article in the New York Times, the Harvard geneticist David Reich wrote,
"I have deep sympathy for the concern that genetic discoveries could be misused to justify racism. But as a geneticist, I also know that it is simply no longer possible to ignore average genetic differences among races. I am worried that well-meaning people who deny the possibility of substantial biological differences among human populations are digging themselves into an indefensible position, one that will not survive the onslaught of science. So how should we prepare for the likelihood that, in the coming years, genetic studies will show that many traits are influenced by genetic variations, and that these traits will differ on average across human populations? It will be impossible, indeed anti-scientific, foolish, and absurd, to deny those differences.
And in 2020, the University of Cambridge philosopher Nathan Kovnas wrote,
Although the genetic origin of race differences can only be definitively established when the fields of genetics and neuroscience are unified in a way that will not happen for several years, less definitive evidence seems to implicate genes.
Okay, you get the point. That was long, but I wanted to highlight the lengthy history of these kinds of predictions. For the past 3 decades, hereditarians have generally been quite confident that science is on the verge of confirming their worldview. But the years drag on and nothing happens. It's not for the lack of trying, though. Geneticists have indeed scoured the human genome looking for the genes undergirding intelligence and other psychological traits, and they have had very little success. The failure of molecular genetics to corroborate the twin studies is known as the missing heritability problem, and there's no sign it's going away anytime soon. A study published in 2022 in Nature Genetics is the latest and most ambitious attempt to find genes associated with educational attainment. It found enough genes to account for 12 to 16% of the variance. This is a long ways off from 80%, and also there's no guarantee that all of these genes actually directly causally affect educational attainment or intelligence. Geneticists use GWAS, genome-wide association studies, to find statistical associations between genes and a certain trait. However, these are just statistical associations. A gene could be consistently associated with a certain trait, but the causal pathway could be environmental. Eric Turkheimer uses the example of red-haired genes. If you imagine a society where red-haired people are discriminated against and generally treated as second-class citizens, and this discrimination leads to lower cognitive ability for red-haired people, then red-haired genes will be consistently associated with lower cognitive ability. But the causal pathway is entirely environmental. So establishing causality is another problem that hasn't been sorted out. Also, this study has a sample size of 3 million. The previous study by this group of researchers was published in 2018 and had a sample size of 1.1 million. It found enough genes to account for 11 to 13% of the variance in educational attainment. So they expanded their sample size by 2 million, and they could only account for slightly more of the variance. And again, causality hasn't been established. So molecular genetics hasn't found much evidence to back up the claims of twin studies. The thesis of the bell curve, the idea that intelligence is 80% heritable, these are still, after all these years, dependent on a handful of twin studies. So what exactly is going on? Well, let's examine twin studies to see what the problem might be. When you think of twin studies, this is what you probably think of. 2 identical twins are separated at birth or when they are very young, and they are raised in substantially different environments. If it turns out that twins reared apart in substantially different environments still bear a close psychological resemblance, then that would offer strong evidence of genetic effects. I get the impression that many people, including many specialists and academics within psychology, think this is what twin studies have found. But that's not the case. For one, a majority of twin studies have examined twins reared together. Most twin studies do not examine identical twins reared apart. Instead, they use an entirely different method of comparing identical twins to fraternal twins reared together. Twin researchers have long argued that if identical twins reared together resemble each other in a trait like IQ more than fraternal twins reared together, this must point to genetic effects. Twin researchers make the equal environment assumption. They assume, to quote one of the original twin studies, that environmental differences are the same for both identical and fraternal twins. Basically, they assume that the variation in the environments of identical twins is the same as for fraternal twins. But this is a very dubious assumption. Identical twin pairs might be treated more similarly than fraternal twin pairs. They might identify with each other more closely than fraternal twins, etc. There have been various attempts to test the equal environment assumption, and most studies have claimed to find support for the assumption. But I am highly skeptical. Attempting to precisely measure the environmental similarities for identical twins reared together is difficult. Researchers don't directly observe the environments of twin pairs, but rather use other methods, such as, for example, questionnaires where twins themselves assess their environmental similarities. Do these methods really work? In light of the failure of molecular genetics to corroborate the twin studies, I think it's very doubtful. But setting that aside, let's turn to pairs of identical twins reared apart. Reared apart twin studies tend to be more persuasive, so hereditarians emphasize them. Studies of twins reared apart have occurred since the 1930s, and appear to offer very strong evidence of genetic effects. These studies have been accompanied by famous anecdotal stories of identical twins being reunited and turning out to have astounding similarities in personality and behavior. But there are some serious problems with these studies and these stories. One major problem with reared apart studies is that they stretch the definition of reared apart. By reared apart, people tend to imagine twins growing up physically separated and with no communication with one another. This would seem like a very basic precondition for a twins reared apart study. But it turns out that it's extremely difficult to find twins who are physically separated with no communication growing up. So reared apart studies end up using pairs of twins who were raised in different households, but who actually grew up in close proximity to and in regular contact with one another. There are three classic reared apart studies from the 1930s to the 1960s, and then there's the most influential twin study of all time, the Minnesota study of twins reared apart. The authors of the first three studies were generous enough to provide detailed information on the participating twins and the degree of separation within twin pairs prior to the beginning of the study. The psychologist J. Joseph uses this data to point out that the majority of twin pairs in these studies grew up in close proximity and in regular contact with one another. Let's go through some examples.
In Shields' 1962 study, we find the following descriptions. Each depicts a different pair of reared-apart identical twins. 14-year-old male twins who did not meet or know they were twins till they were 5 or 6. From the age of 9, they met once a week when Kenneth's family came to live in the town. 17-year-old male twins whose mother died the day after the twins were born. The paternal aunts decided to take one twin each, and they have brought them up amicably, living next door to one another. They are constantly in and out of each other's houses. 38-year-old male twins who at age 11 lived in cottages next door to one another and attended the same school. 23-year-old female twins separated at 6 months. They were reunited from 5 to 7 years, then parted again. They meet every weekend now. 30-year-old female twins separated at 13 months. Though attending different schools, the twins met about twice a week and sometimes spent holidays together. 32-year-old female twins separated at 5 years, brought up in the same town, not always same school, met regularly. 39-year-old female twins separated from birth till 11 years and again at 16. Viola was taken by the grandparents at birth, while Olga remained with the parents, living nearby in the same industrial area. There are many more examples in Shield's study, but from these descriptions it is clear that few of his pairs were truly reared apart. As Shields himself acknowledged, his twins' environments have not as a rule been extremely different.
When it comes to the Minnesota study of twins reared apart, a similar analysis can't be done, because the researchers didn't provide the same information. All they did was trot out a few selected pairs of twins to the media, while concealing information on the rest. Due to the absence of data, we can't know the degree of separation of the twins in this study. But considering the prior 3 studies, I think it's fair to suspect that most twin pairs in the Minnesota study were similarly reared apart, only in a weak sense. It's simply extremely difficult to find twins who are truly reared apart in a very strong sense, as in being raised in substantially different environments, preferably with no contact with one another. Identical twins, for one, are rare. According to the British NHS, a woman only has a 1 in 250 chance of giving birth to identical twins. Then those twins have to be separated at birth or a very young age, which is another rare event. It's safe to assume that only a small fraction of identical twins are separated. Then those twins have to be pulled into households which are substantially different in their demographic characteristics, which is another rare event. Most twins reared apart still grow up in close proximity with contact with one another in similar environments. When you multiply those odds, it's easy to surmise that there are vanishingly few pairs of twins reared apart in a very strong sense. And then the researchers have to find these twins, which is much easier said than done. They may not even be aware of their twins' existence, and then both twins have to agree to partake in the study. With all these obstacles in place, it's unsurprising that there are no studies primarily examining twins reared apart in a very strong sense. In the absence of concrete data, the public has been inundated with stories of identical twins reared apart who found each other later in life and discovered they had astonishing similarities. These stories were presented to the public by researchers in the Minnesota study of twins reared apart. They include cases like Oscar Stower and Jack Yufei, the Jim twins, the Fireman twins, and so forth. J. Joseph strongly criticizes this practice of presenting twins to the public who have or appear to have remarkable similarities. For one, how can we trust that the researchers aren't being highly selective about who they present to the public? Are they just as willing to show pairs who are dissimilar in personality and behavior? And among the pairs the researchers do present, are they giving an honest depiction of the similarities and differences, or selectively highlighting the similarities? And secondly, some of the details of these stories are rather outlandish. Take the Jim twins.
Both had married a girl named Linda, divorced her, then married a second time to a woman called Betty. Lewis had named his first son James Allen. Springer had called his son James Allen. Both had owned a dog as a boy and named it Toy. Both spent their holidays at the same beach near St. Petersburg in Florida. Both drove there and back in the same kind of car, a Chevrolet. Both bit their fingernails, right down until there is nothing left. Both have basement workshops and work in wood, building frames, and furniture. Both chain smoke Salems. Both enjoy stock car racing and dislike baseball. Both scatter love notes around the house.
This all sounds very compelling, but has all this actually been independently verified? As far as I can tell, the answer is no. We just have to trust the Minnesota researchers who had a very obvious hereditarian bias, and the Jim twins themselves. A story which isn't as outlandish is that of the Fireman twins. Mark Newman and Jerry Levy were twin brothers who were separated at birth and later found each other in adulthood. Both happened to be working as firefighters. The fact that both became firefighters was interpreted by the Minnesota researchers as proof of the power of genes. But are genes really the only possible explanation? I don't think so. The problem is that even if twins are fully separated and have no contact interact with one another growing up, they could still very well grow up in similar environments, and so seemingly remarkable similarities can still be entirely environmental in origin. The Jim twins both grew up as working-class white men in Ohio, and plus they looked identical, which could have elicited similar treatment from others growing up. So even if some of these outlandish details are true, it doesn't necessarily attest to the power of genes. Similar appearance plus similar environments could produce two people who are remarkably similar, and genes could have nothing to do with it. The same is true for the Fireman twins, who both reportedly grew up in middle-income Jewish households in New Jersey, and again, they looked identical, which might have elicited similar treatment growing up. When it comes to cases of twins truly reared apart in a very strong sense, again, there are vanishingly few. I could only find a handful of isolated cases in the literature, but these cases are very telling in my opinion. I'll give 3 examples. One such case was in the Minnesota study. The researchers found a pair of twin brothers, one of whom was raised by illiterate parents, while the other was raised by well-educated parents. The difference in IQ scores between the twins was 29 points. This is an absolutely enormous gap. It's roughly 2 standard deviations. For some perspective, the black-white IQ gap is 1 standard deviation. One of the researchers, the psychologist David Lincoln, speculated with no evidence whatsoever that the twin raised by illiterate parents suffered brain damage. A more recent case was examined by psychologist Nancy Siegel, concerning twin sisters who had been separated at the age of 2. One sister was raised in a white household in the United States, and the other was raised in South Korea. The difference in IQ scores between the twins was 16 points, which is about 1 standard deviation. In another case from 2014, Siegel investigated identical twins in Colombia separated at birth. One pair grew up in a middle-income urban family, and the other pair grew up in a poor rural family. Siegel told the New York Times that the twins showed major differences in their psychological characteristics, and that she, quote, came away with a real respect for the effect of an extremely different environment. But she never elaborated more on the exact nature of these differences. And variously throughout the twin studies literature, I occasionally found mentions of twins reared apart in very different environments who demonstrate large differences in behavior and personality, but not much detail is made available. In the few cases we see of twins reared apart in a very strong sense, major psychological differences are observed, and molecular genetics has failed to confirm the high heritability estimates produced by twin studies. The problem extends to well beyond intelligence. It concerns psychological traits in general, including psychiatric disorders, extroversion, criminality, political orientation, sexuality, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. Scientists have tried and failed to find the genes. Along the way, false positives have been breathlessly and irresponsibly reported by the media, as documented by science writer John Horgan. People are told that psychological traits and psychiatric disorders are genetic purely on the basis of twin studies. And especially insidiously, people are told that social inequality is genetically based to some major degree. But it's just not true. All this still leaves the question, though. What causes inequality, specifically in capitalist societies? What is the source of inequalities in wealth and income? Why do people have different economic outcomes in life? Well, it turns out that answering this question requires using methods from the so-called hard sciences. In a previous video, I talked about econophysics, which is a heterodox branch of economics that uses methods from physics and statistical mechanics. Econophysics has actually provided a robust explanation for why capitalist economies inevitably generate huge economic inequality. Back in 2000, the physicists Victor Yakovenko and Adrian Dragulescu published a paper entitled The Statistical Mechanics of Money, where they explain how market economies generate wealth inequality. To explain their argument, I'm going to present an analogy that I also made in my Unlearning Economics video. Imagine gas particles in a closed system. The particles are constantly interacting and exchanging energy in a chaotic and random fashion. The total amount of energy in the system is conserved in every energy exchange, so the gain of one particle is the loss of another. We know through the application of statistical mechanics that as time goes on and the entropy in the system rises, the distribution of energy among the gas particles trends toward an exponential distribution where the vast majority of gas particles have very little energy, while a minority possess huge amounts of energy. Iacovencu and Dragulescu reasoned that this is analogous to what happens with money in market economies. Within a market economy, there are millions of individuals buying and selling goods and services, and money is always conserved within every exchange. They argue that as time progresses and the entropy in the system rises, the distribution of money will tend toward a Boltzmann-Gibbs distribution. The great majority of people will have little to no money, while a small minority will end up rich, and the rich have no special quality beyond being simply lucky. They then compared their prediction to data on individual income in the USA, and found that income does indeed have a Boltzmann-Gibbs distribution. However, there remained a problem. The Boltzmann-Gibbs distribution only fit the bottom 97% of the population. For the remaining top 3%, income followed a Pareto distribution. This is a power law which ends up producing a far greater degree of inequality than predicted by Boltzmann-Gibbs. Later on, the Marxist computer scientist Ian Wright found that when one allows for the buying and selling of labor power, the Pareto distribution for the top 3% emerges. Once you allow for workers to be hired as employees, in other words, once you include the exploitation of labor, the Pareto distribution appears. The implication of econophysics is that 1. Wealth is largely randomly distributed. Even if everyone within a market economy starts off with the exact same amount of money, and even if everyone is identical in intelligence, personality, and behavior, a vast inequality will inevitably be produced simply because of how markets maximize entropy. Now, there are other inequalities along the lines of race, ethnicity, and gender, but these don't affect the overall shape of the distribution. Boltzmann-Gibbs under a Pareto is what you're inevitably going to get in a market capitalist economy, regardless of the ethnic or gender composition at each rung of the economic ladder. And it will persist even if you say eliminated IQ gaps between classes and ethnicities. Econophysics also shows that the Marxist theory of exploitation is indeed correct. Inevitably, those on the lower end of the wealth distribution end up with nothing to sell but their labor power. A segment of the lucky winners on the higher end of the distribution purchase and exploit the labor of those on the lower end. The top 3% consists of those who become super wealthy through exploiting the labor of workers. So lastly, this still leaves the question of why there is a correlation between wealth and performance on different measures of cognitive ability. The conventional wisdom says that intelligence produces economic success, but econophysics implies that the causality tends to go in the other direction. Wealth greatly affects access to quality education. Wealthier households have access to better schools and tutors. And also, the stress caused by economic insecurity has been shown to directly produce cognitive damage. Economic insecurity is just not very conducive to cognitive development. Alright, that's it for today. See you next time.